Welcome to Curious Campus, where we talk to professors from various departments at the University of Toronto about a recent research topic they've dived into, breaking down these new developments for everyone to understand. Stay tuned, you'll definitely learn something new. I'm Chavi, and today I'm here with Professor Felan Parker, and we're going to talk about his research in swarming San Diego Comic Con. To introduce Felan Parker is an associate professor at St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto and a scholar of media industries and cultures, specializing in games, digital media, and film. Previously, Dr. Parker also served as vice president and president of the Canadian Games Studies Association, and from 2015 to 2017, he held a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada postdoctoral fellowship at Concordia University's Technoculture Art and Games Research Center. A scholar in creative media and its associated industries, his current research interests focus on the role of intermediaries like curators, critics, and community organizers in the cultural ecosystem of the game industry. As mentioned, we're here to discuss his research project, Swarming San Diego Comic Con, to better understand what role the event plays in contemporary media pop culture. Without further ado, Balin, welcome to Curious Campus.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Really glad. So, to begin our discussion, I'm very curious about how you fell into this line of research and particularly looking at gaming and digital media.
Yeah, so my background is in film studies. I did an undergrad and a master's in film studies, but I was always interested in media more broadly, particularly video games, also comics, right? Sort of standard nerdy kid sort of spectrum of interests. And so as far back as high school, I remember trying to find ways to work video games into my assignments and things like that. And that continued in my undergrad. And by the time I was doing my master's, I was pretty confident that I wanted to do something to do with video games for my PhD. I wasn't quite sure what that would look like yet, but it sort of made sense to go a little broader than film studies. Film studies is a highly interdisciplinary field. Lots of people do great work in game studies from sort of a film studies perspective. But I kind of felt like I needed a little bit more of a broader scope. So I sort of shifted tracks slightly to the parallel field of communication and media studies. And I think the thing that over time kind of congealed for me as like what I found interesting was, you mentioned the cultural ecosystem idea, right? I'm very interested in how the processes by which our media and popular culture is made and circulated shapes the kinds of things that are possible, right? Like, what are the industrial contexts? What are the sort of reception or fandom contexts that kind of act as a kind of structure within which different ideas come to the fore and other kinds of ideas or images or sort of, experiences maybe don't come to the fore. Like for me, looking at media texts, right? Like analyzing a piece of media closely is super interesting. And I love reading that kind of analysis. But my own instinct, my own research has always gone to like, well, how did it get to this point, right? Like, what were the structures in place beyond just like, oh, an individual creative person made this? It's like, well, what kind of industrial or non-industrial context were they working in? What sort of, funding constraints were there? What was the labor involved like? And then on the other end of actually making the thing, how did it spread, right? How did people come to be aware of this piece of media, whether it's like, a scrappy little indie game or a big Hollywood blockbuster movie? How does it find its way to audiences and what do audiences do with that? So sort of thinking in cultural studies terms, like the whole circuit of culture from production, distribution, reception, and on it goes.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I believe you teach the SMC course about like understanding video games.
I do, yes. How to play video games is what it's currently called. Or no, how to study video games. I'm sorry. The book I use is called How to Play Video Games. Yeah, that's a fun little course. It's, one of the first year foundations courses. So it's very, small, intimate. And yeah, we just kind of like talk about like, well, what does it mean to look critically at media and culture using video games as our primary type of media, but I think like the skills and the perspectives that we learn in that class are relevant to media in general. And it also doubles as sort of a crash course in basic academic skills, like how do you use the library? What does good writing look like? How does citation work? All that stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. So, getting to the specific research project about the San Diego Comic Con, as someone who is not familiar about Comic Cons, like what makes the San Diego one like special and why was it like the focus of this project?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing about San Diego Comic-Con, and I always like to point out that it's the only Comic-Con with a hyphen, like Comic Dash Con is copyrighted by the San Diego Comic-Con, or I guess more specifically Comic-Con International, which is the not-for-profit organization that runs it. It's not the biggest con type thing in the world. I believe that honor goes to Comic-Cat, the comic market in Japan, but San Diego Comic Con is quite large. It's like over 100,000 people in an average year. And it holds a particular sort of like cultural and economic status. Part of why scholars have been interested in Comic Con for a long time is that its geographic proximity and its cultural status in relation to Hollywood and increasingly also Silicon Valley has sort of over time turned it into a place that media industries turn to access audiences. San Diego Comic Con fans are accurately or not often seen by the industry as kind of a bellwether or like a kind of canary in the coal mine for pop culture to be able to sort of, the idea being if you market something to like the hardcore fandom at San Diego Comic Con and it works well, you probably have a hit on your hands. That absolutely does not always work out. There are examples such as I believe Scott Pilgrim versus the World, or versus the Universe, I guess the movie is called. Great movie, was very popular at Comic Con, didn't do particularly well with a wider audience. That said, it has retained that status for Hollywood. So, one of the things that makes it distinct is the fact that this is where you're going to go and see like big exclusive reveals of trailers for new Marvel projects and things like that, right? This is where you're going to see bona fide celebrities, right? As opposed to sort of like someone who's on like a popular sci-fi TV show in the 90s, but isn't particularly well known outside of that. Like this is where you're going to see your Robert Downey Jr.'s, your Jamie Lee Curtis's, whatever. And so it has this kind of outsized cultural and economic influence. And one of the things that also makes it interesting is, as I mentioned, it's technically a not-for-profit entity. It's technically an educational entity, actually. Like the mandate of Comic-Con International is to sort of produce knowledge, to spread knowledge about comics and the art of creating comics and other adjacent fields. It's always been a very multimedia con, in spite of the fact that it's called Comic Con, like movies and, cult TV and things like that have been part of it basically since the beginning. But it has this interesting sort of contradiction in a way, right? Of like, on the one hand, it's like, oh, this is where the biggest media industries in the world go to market their stuff. And at the same time, it has this kind of grassroots, not-for-profit sort of like, identity that is also attached. And that is, as you would imagine, like that contradiction plays out in all kinds of interesting tensions at the level of the con itself. Comic-Con is so big and sprawling, and it encompasses such a great variety of things that it is no one thing, right? Like it is absolutely just like a crass commercial, just hype engine for big blockbuster products or not so big products that are trying to reach an audience, right? It's a hugely consumerist space for, buying exclusive merch and toys and rare comics and things like that. But at the same time, it is also very much a space of like grassroots community gathering, right? There are many, many overlapping fandoms and social scenes within the larger Comic-Con umbrella, right? When you're at Comic-Con, you see people who have like their badges from like decades of Comic-Cons in some cases because it's the social event of the year for some of these communities. And so one of the things that makes it really interesting is that kind of dissonance within the thing, right? It is many things at once, and it isn't always a sort of like harmonious whole, right? It's a messy field site in that sense. And it's sort of interesting, right? Because when people hear Comic Con, they often think of like the whole spectrum of events like this, right? People think, oh, like Toronto Fan Expo or Anime North just happened here in Toronto. And those are very much cons, right? We would describe them as these similar kinds of like fan media industry kind of sites of contact. But there is something distinct about San Diego Comic Con. And despite it all, despite how long it's been running, despite many, many setbacks over the years, including, of course, most recently, the major interruption of the global pandemic, they have seemingly continued to maintain this special status, both for fans and the industry.
Mm. Did the San Diego Comic Con like specifically become what it was because of it's okay, like was it, oh, we're gonna host the San Diego Comic Con and integrate all of these influences, or was it trying to be like a more traditional, so to speak, Comic Con of
Right. That's a really interesting question. And I have to shout out one of my collaborators on this project, Erin Hanna. Her book, Only at Comic Con, includes some really rich historical, like archival analysis of like where the con comes from. And one of the things that she talks about and has identified through that research is that like it really was always eclectic in scope. It was certainly much smaller in the early days, but from very early on, you saw again, like comics, old cult horror movies, TV, like a variety of things being brought together under the same umbrella. And from very early on, having an industry presence was part of the goal. In the earliest days, the idea, and this is like in the 1970s, like very late 60s into the 70s, when you sort of see the proto San Diego Comic Con events happening, the idea was that people could go, people who were fans, but also aspiring creators of comics or like science fiction literature or whatever, could go to the con and actually meet the greats, right? Jack Kirby, the famous comic artist, was a fixture of the early Comic Con era. And there's much written about, how people interacted with him and stuff like that. And so that is an industry presence, right? It wasn't necessarily a promotional presence, but it absolutely was part of the deal. And there are stories about how, again, very early on, marketers for the first Star Wars film, for example, went to Comic-Con to like show some posters and kind of like do some very early promotion for the film. That doesn't necessarily mean that like, oh, and we can connect the dots directly from that to like what we have today. But I think it does show that this thing has always been, again, thanks in part just to its geographic proximity to Hollywood, has always had that kind of like promotional potential, and people have always been tapping that. I guess the other piece of it is like, as I mentioned, it's very much like a space of consumption. And one of the papers that, we may end up writing about this has to do with consumption and the sort of experience of just like shopping your way through Comic-Con, basically, whether it's window shopping because you can't afford anything or, dropping way more money than you plan to on random collectibles and books and things like that. But going back to the earliest days, it was also like a dealer's convention. And so people who sold back issues of comics would gather. There would be a whole room called the dealer's room or the dealer's hall. And that's where collectors would go to be like, well, I need, Amazing Spider-Man #2 for my collection. And this is maybe where I can find it in, a long box or whatever. The dealer's room over time kind of morphs from being a place where you're primarily buying like print material, like comics or posters, into the massive, like multiple, like I think it's 2 football fields size exhibition hall that we have now, which is just like, anything you could conceivably want to buy related to a popular cultural product is probably available, right? Ranging from super, super small scale independent artists like selling hand printed zines to, again, your Marvels, your Disneys, your HarperCollins publishers, like all these giant media conglomerates are in the same giant space as like the smaller actors.
that's really cool. So going into the San Diego Comic Con, and as you mentioned, like there have been lots of other studies that have been based around this. What were you hoping to find with your group specifically?
Yeah, so I personally come to this in a funny way because I had never been to Comic Con before this project. I was very much the newbie in that sense on this. My collaborator, Ben Wu from Carleton, who is the principal investigator on this project, he and I had known each other for a while and were doing similar kinds of research about like the role of cultural intermediaries and events on my side, in the game industry and sort of indie game scenes, and on his side in the comic space. So he had already been studying smaller Comic Con type events. Like he was sort of actively trying not to do stuff on San Diego because San Diego was so well represented in the research. But what sort of happened was we started talking about methods and really, like I often say that the real research question for this project of like doing what we've called like a swarm ethnography is like, what might we learn if we studied Comic-Con with a large distributed team? Like that's in a lot of ways the primary research question was this sort of methodological experiment. That said, there are more specific, kind of more, critical academic questions that we went into it with. The thing about any event like this, but especially Comic-Con, is the way that it structures and shapes the encounter between media industries and audiences, right? And so lots of previous research has discussed this. This isn't a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. But what we wanted to do with this project was like any one researcher who goes to Comic-Con is going to have a very specific path through it, right? Like one individual is going to see a tiny fraction of what is on offer at the con in any given year. And so what we wanted to do was sort of like think more expansively about all the different things that happen at Comic-Con through a kind of multi-perspectival approach, right? By literally having just way more sets of eyes and ears and noses and feet distributed across the convention in order to, in theory, just like apprehend it in a more holistic way, right? Like perceive what is going on at Comic-Con in a broader way. And so we brought together a number of, again, like I'm very much the novice in this group, a bunch of like very talented, like well-known fan and media industry scholars who had already written about cons in one way or another. Most of them were pretty seasoned Comic-Con veterans, along with Ben and myself to sort of like work out what this could look like and what we might learn. Like in some ways, the easiest thing to do is to like jump ahead to like, well, here's some of the stuff that we did ultimately learn, right? In terms of things that we're actively writing up, like promotion definitely became a major theme, sort of looking at how does this function as a kind of like engine of promotion, an engine to advance like consumption, basically, whether it's consumption of like, marketing materials or movies or actual media texts or consumption of collectibles. One of the things that Erin Hanna's book, Only at Comic-Con, sort of really lays out clearly is this idea that of like Comic-Con is about producing exclusivity, right? It's exclusive in the sense that there are way more people want to go than actually get to go, both in terms of limited tickets and in terms of like it's very expensive if you don't live in San Diego to travel there and the tickets aren't cheap either. Exclusive also in terms of like you are going to be in the room potentially when they announce a new project, or you're going to be able to line up to buy like a toy or a special poster that's only available at Comic-Con. And that exclusivity is in a lot of ways not all it crack up to be in the sense that like, well, you're going to see that trailer 3 weeks or 2 weeks before the rest of the universe sees that trailer, right? You're going to get that toy, and then a whole bunch of other people are going to get that toy, and they're going to sell it on eBay, right? But it's also, again, about like the experience of being there. And that, in some ways, is maybe, that's not something you can like capture and export elsewhere quite so easily. It's the sort of full sensory, emotional experience of being there. So, promotion is definitely a big theme coming out of what we learned. An emergent theme that we were not expecting was the joint Hollywood strikes, the writers and actors strikes that happened in 2023. So when that was announced, there was a huge amount of discourse about like how this would affect Comic-Con. This was going to be the first full-scale in-person version of Comic-Con since 2019, I suppose. There had been two sort of online versions. There had been a tentative, like, mini version that was in the fall rather than in the summer in 2021, I believe. And then there had been a lower capacity version in 2022. And so we ended up with this kind of fascinating new thing to study, right? We were not necessarily expecting this to be something that would affect anything to do with our project. We went into it expecting something like a normal Comic-Con, whatever that is. But what we've sort of, come to learn is that like there's kind of no such thing as a normal Comic-Con. There's always something, right? There's is always different, and people are constantly debating whether the con has like lost touch with its like mythological roots, or if it's, on the other hand, if like the absence of Hollywood stuff is going to ruin it, And so there's all this debate, all this stuff. And what was really interesting for me was like, despite all of this discussion about like Hollywood's not going to be there, and people would either be like utopian about it and very optimistic to be like, it's going to be just for the fans, it's going to be out comics again. Or they'd be very dystopian and like, well, there's going to be no celebrities, Hollywood's going to be gone, and like they're never going to come back. It's going to ruin the con forever, right? When you're there, it's like Hollywood is everywhere, right? It is still hugely oriented around the mainstream, entertainment media industries and popular cultural industries. Promotion was everywhere, right? Like literally entire buildings around the convention center are like wrapped like floor to roof in advertisements for like, the animation block on Fox or whatever. And so what I found really interesting, and Aaron and I are working on a paper about this, was this kind of like weirdly like haunting presence and absence around the idea of Hollywood, right? Like it's sort of like Hollywood is everywhere, but the fact that its most visible elements, specifically celebrities promoting their movies or their TV shows, created this weird, almost uncanny sense of like, oh, it's different. It's not the same. And there were material differences, right? Like Hall H is where you see the biggest like premieres, right? It has these massive screens. It's like an arms race in there, like all the different studios trying to like outdo one another with like even bigger screens and even more exclusive trailers and whatever. And that's where you see the sort of like, the stereotypical images of Comic-Con of people like camping out or waiting in line for like days to get into Hall H usually, or there's another ballroom that's also very large, but Hall H is kind of the major one. This year, it wasn't that hard to get into because the promotional stuff was scaled back. There was a lot of panels canceled. A lot of the major studios scaled back their involvement. And so, I wasn't expecting to get in there. I wasn't even going to try. I was like, this is my first time. I'm not going to go out of my way. But then it was like, well, I mean, this is actually only like a 20-minute, 30-minute line to get in here. And then there's like empty space everywhere. It's not crowded. So that was kind of interesting to be able to go in and see. But there were all these ways that promotion for Hollywood projects still ended up happening, right? Like among some of the things that I saw in Hall H were big panel about the Sony's Spider-Man 2 video game that came out later that year, which because video game companies weren't among the struck companies, there were actors. They weren't like mega celebrities, but the great Tony Todd was there, for example, plays Venom in that game, great character actor, and like the other cast members. And it was really interesting because there was this kind of like elephant in the room about like, okay, well, there's a strike happening, but like we're here promoting a project that is like a Sony and Disney product, right? It's a Disney owned brand produced by Sony, two of the big five, big four, whatever we want to call them, media companies. And the actors themselves, like the voice actors themselves, did take the opportunity to sort of like clarify that and be like, we are in solidarity with our guilds. Like, we are here promoting a game, not a movie or a TV show. Like, make no mistake, like, we are like supportive of this strike. And so those moments of rupture were really interesting. Also, though, it was really interesting to see where it kind of got like glossed over or smoothed over. Like, directors weren't on strike, right? Like film and television directors weren't on strike, writers and actors were. And usually directors, they might participate on a panel, but they're not usually like in the spotlight in the way that an act or even a TV show writer might be. And so directors were suddenly kind of like the main way to promote these things, right? And so there was like panels that weren't necessarily officially organized by the big media companies, but featured exclusively, directors of projects coming out from Disney or whatever, right? And so it sort of was this kind of backdoor, side door promotion happening. And the end result was that like there was really no less Hollywood than usual, I think, at the con, but people felt like it wasn't there in a different way. And that raises, I think, some really interesting questions about like the immersion, like the permeation of Hollywood, like big media industry products into our lives, right? Like the fact that we're sort of swimming in this all the time to the point where, much like, walking through Sankofa Square here in Toronto or something like that, where you're like surrounded by ads, but you're kind of not seeing any of them, right? Like you're just tuning it out. That is a pretty critical thing to investigate, I think, right? Like, how is it that we become inured to a barrage of promotional materials, whether it's for entertainment products or consumer products? So yeah, the strike became really interesting. The other thing that I'll say about the strike, and this is stuff that colleagues are working on, including Suzanne Scott and Melanie Conan and Shauna Kidman, all from different perspectives, are looking at the sort of labor implications of this. There's a long history of looking at fandom through a labor lens because, of course, fan labor, like the stuff that fans do, is for its own sake, right? It's for themselves and other fans, but it also absolutely benefits media industries, at least some of the time, right? At least certain kinds of fandom, right? And so, in context of the strike, that labor question became quite visible and somewhat fraught, I would say. Suzanne, for example, Suzanne Scott is writing about cosplayers, right? People who dress up in costumes for Comic-Con. Again, one of the stereotypical images of Comic-Con is a bunch of people in costumes. And at this stage, there are like pseudo professional cosplayers, right? Like people who have monetized their cosplay through digital platforms, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or YouTube or whatever. And so they're kind of working, right? Like when they're at Comic-Con in costume, they're there as fans, but they're also there kind of working. And there was a lot of discussion amongst those folks, especially folks who maybe had aspirations to one day become actors, to one day join the industry. Like, are we scabbing by being in costume with like a Mandalorian costume, for example, like a Disney product? Whatever else you might be, you are kind of a walking billboard for a Disney product, right? So, like, should we not be dressing up in Disney related costumes or Paramount related costumes? And there was no answer, right? There's no clear answer to that. But it really highlighted this blurry boundary between like what is the industry and what is fandom, what is professional and what is amateur, right? And these are larger dynamics. This isn't specifically about Comic-Con or even about, the strikes or whatever else, but being at Comic-Con during the strikes really like brought that to the fore. It made it very visible in a super interesting way. Similarly, my colleague Melanie Conan is writing about the performers at pop-up interactive activations that happen at Comic-Con, where one of the big ones when we were there was for the Anne Rice Immortals, like vampire universe, where it was like a recreation of a New Orleans block, right? Like I think like a maybe early 20th century or 19th century version of New Orleans with a bunch of performers like pretending to be vampires, pretending to be street performers, interacting with people. And of course that's pretty close in some ways to like acting, right? That's pretty close to the labor that was being withheld from major studios. A lot of those performers are non-union, and so they're in this kind of gray area. So Melanie's sort of investigating that. So yeah, the strikes really were an unexpected, but ultimately, I would say kind of welcome complication to the project because it really gave us a bunch of new things to investigate.
That's really cool. And how much research did you personally, as someone who wasn't well versed in like, I guess like Comic-Con attendance, how much did you have to like look into it before and to be able to go in and actually make the most of your time and like discover this?
That's a really good question. And so I came to this having been to some similar events, nothing that big, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think I'd ever been to anything this big. I'd been to like game industry related things to do research, so I knew what to expect. And I should say that I shared that with the six undergrad students and the five-ish grad students who were also on the project, right? We had a collective team of about 20 people, all kind of going off in our own directions to do the research while we were there. And so the majority of us were new to Comic-Con. And so one of the things that we did was we did kind of like a crash course boot camp with the people who have been there many, many times to sort of get advice on, and everything from sort of strategic advice around like, well, here's like if you really want to see a panel, show up two panels earlier because they don't clear the rooms in between panels. You can actually just like park it in a seat and sit through two panels you don't necessarily care about to see the thing you want. And this is what people do. To the more like kind of practical, just like taking care of a human body things, like, this is actually advice that I had heard from game developers at previous conferences, but like bring more than one pair of shoes so you can switch it up day to day to like keep your feet supported and, water and snacks and things like this, good places to get food. We didn't want anyone going in and just being like, just completely overwhelmed and like shutting down completely because that's not conducive to research. Although I will say like being able to articulate that experience of overwhelm is useful for like, the kind of ethnographic research that we were doing. So there was a lot of that. There was also just a lot of reading, but I personally, some of my colleagues on this project had very rigidly scheduled activities, right? Like, not that they would have every minute of every day planned out. Part of the advice that they were giving us was like, you need to leave space for like just unexpected, emergent things. You should have like multiple backups for everything that you would like to do in case you don't get in or whatever. But they would have plans. Like, they would be paying attention for weeks or months in advance. And I think a lot of diehard San Diego fans do this. For me, I was kind of like, I might as well embrace my novice status, like I'm going to go into this. Not that I didn't browse the schedule, not that there weren't specific things that I did want to see just as a fan of things, but I really tried to go in and like go with the flow a little bit just to see what it was like. And it is very overwhelming. It is very physically exhausting. Even just moving through the space, not only is it just very large, so it takes a long time to get through it, it's crowded in most areas. And so you're moving at a snail's pace, kind of, like squeaking through people and, bumping into people and things like that. And I think I appreciated going in a little bit green, a little bit unprepared because I was very much open to, oh, like this line is actually really short for this thing. I'm going to see what the deal is. Lines are a big thing at Congress. There's lines everywhere and they're incredibly structured. They aren't always like well organized, but there are tons. I shouldn't say that actually. I would say on the whole, the lines are extremely well organized thanks to the work of like staff and volunteers. Like people are holding up signs being like this line ends here, and they'll tell you if like, okay, we do not expect people past this point to get into this panel, right? Like there's a lot of communication in most cases, and these are lines that like, wrap all the way around buildings and outside and things like that. So it's a huge part of the experience is just waiting in line. And at one point there was a panel about Studio Ghibli. I think it was like an anniversary panel related to My Neighbor Totoro. And that's my favorite movie. I really wanted to go to this panel, and I knew that my odds were bad based on when I was getting there. Like I got in line literally outside the building, like under like a tent, and volunteers were telling us is very low chance of getting in, just so you know, right? They don't want to give people. And I was like, I'm just gonna see what happens. Like it wasn't that I was like, I maybe had a little bit of false hope, but it was also just kind of like, what is it like, right? And that's sort of the purpose of doing this kind of experiential participant observation research is it's like, well, what does it feel like to wait in line for something that you're probably not going to get into? And it was really, it sucked, obviously, but it was also really interesting just to sort of like hear the conversations around me, chat a little bit with people next to me in line. This is a big thing about like there is a line culture in a way, right? Like it is not unusual for people who don't know one another to strike up a conversation, the idea being, well, we're all in line for something that we're interested in. So probably we have something in common, right? And people really like often broadcast their fandoms, whether by it through costumes or just like, merch and pins and things like this. So you kind of like, if you're a fellow Star Wars fan, you're going to be able to identify pretty quickly who else is into it. And I sort of went on this like emotional journey with a person who was ahead of me in line who was just like constantly like rising hope and then hopes dashed again when the line stopped moving like over and over again. And that's as much a part of what this event is for a lot of people as anything else, right? Is that kind of like just waiting, but also the kind of social encounter that the line involves. That was an interesting experience and like not necessarily one that I would have had if I had been like very careful about like scheduling my time. It's difficult at a place like this where your attention is being demanded by everything around you to maintain a kind of like, semi-critical distance, right? And the point isn't to be like a totally disconnected observer, but you want to be able to like pay attention in sort of like a somewhat non-judgmental way so that later you can like write it all up and then start doing the interpretation and analysis. And I think not having as much of a plan helped with that for me to be able to again like wander the exhibition hall. Like one day where I decided to just do the entire exhibition hall, just like up and down the aisles, like, and again, this is like the size of two football fields, I believe. So it was like a full day, maybe a day and a bit. And it was just like, okay, well, I've kind of seen everything here. Like I have a sense of the wild scope of like there are gotcha machines and there are like, original costumes from like Star Wars TV shows that are upcoming. And there's like, a million different toys ranging from like the cheapest pieces of crap to like these like incredibly high end, like multiple hundreds of dollars collectibles, everything, right? And so that was really interesting and definitely informed my sense of, again, like what is the cultural work that this event does, right? What is the significance of what happens here?
That is so cool. And To me, that really like heightens the point of like taking up the opportunity to experience such things. Kind of just like experiencing it and seeing how other people experience it, especially as like, more diehard fans.
For sure, yeah. And this idea of like a swarm, right, was really helpful for that because of course not everyone had the same experience as me. We had the veterans who were going through and they were also documenting their experiences, their much more kind of like carefully organized experiences. And we also had the students, right? This was a somewhat multi-generational group of people, right? Sort of ranging in age over the course of probably like 25 years from oldest to youngest. And so there were things that happened that I might have just like walked right by and not really thought of as important that some of the students, some of my undergrads who were working on the project were like immediately like, oh, like I know exactly what this is. One of my favorite stories about this was a group of the undergrads heard about, I think they saw someone wearing an orange Camp Half-Blood t-shirt from the Percy Jackson universe. And it was a promotional item for the Disney Plus show that has since been released. They saw that shirt and they were like, we must have it. They grew up with it, Percy Jackson kids. And so like they saw it and were like, we have to find out where this came from. And I can't remember, they either asked the person or like heard through the grapevine that it was a giveaway. Like it was like a thing. And then they found out that there was like a secret password you had to say. Like you had to go to a particular place and then say a specific password in order to receive these t-shirts. And so their field notes are great because it's this like mad dash across like multiple city blocks in pursuit of this goal. And then they finally get there and they figure out the password and they get the t-shirts and it's like some of the last one, maybe the last ones. And so they have this like sense of like pride and like they're kind of lording it over other people who don't know where they came from or whatever. And it was like, you couldn't pay me to do that, right? Like even if I was super interested in Percy Jackson, especially at that time, like I wouldn't have even known what that t-shirt was from, let alone having the wherewithal to sort of figure out. And that's sort of part of the value of doing this kind of like participant observation or ethnographic work is like you suspend your judgment to an extent, but you don't just like erase your identity and your own fandom and your own interests, right? Like, and so in embodying that experience, the students were able to actually capture something quite vivid about what it's like to be at the con and like what the con does, what it's for, right? Because ultimately this was promotion, right? This was very effective promotion for this upcoming show. I'm sure they will all treasure those orange t-shirts, for the rest of their lives, heirlooms now. So yeah, like having just a wide variety of different perspectives on the team was hugely valuable to kind of get away from that, like whatever my own kind of narrow tunnel vision would have been of such a big sprawling event.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I'm really curious about this now. Like, how is this like research like structured? You've talked about how there were like your 20 or so person team was filled with people who had been to Comic Cons a lot, had been filled with like students. How is this the swarm ethnographic research like connected? Because I'm not really like sure how it would be conducted like normally, but like it's like a big convention center. It's very unstructured. So did you guys like each have like a sort of I know how you've talked about your own experience of having like a semi plan of like how you I guess conquer this Comic Con. Did like everyone else like come in with some sort of plan?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And like, this is handy because one of the papers that I'm writing up right now, I was at a writing retreat last week writing about this, so it's all fresh in my mind, is about the method itself and like what we did, what worked, what didn't, things like that. And one of the things that was really transformative for the project is we received this grant. We proposed this grant in 2019. We received the grant I want to say early April 2020. Full lockdown, like nothing happening. Nobody even really knew what was going to happen next, right? And so right away, we were like, okay, well, there's not going to be a Comic Con this year. There was an online version, right? So the original plan was to sort of prepare for about a year and then go to Comic Con in 2021. We ultimately ended up preparing for 2 and a bit years and went to Comic Con 2023. And that extended timeline was incredibly valuable. Like in some ways, that's like the biggest takeaway or advice is like if you're doing any kind of collaborative research, build in an extended ramp up just to get to know one another, discuss, like read together. And so the faculty team spent a very long time just like in Zoom meetings, we would read a book about how to do ethnography. Because not all of us were coming into this as experienced social scientists either. Like I have done a fair bit of like empirical research, interviews, ethnography, and stuff like that, but not a ton. And I definitely was never formally trained. And different members of the team had different levels of experience. So we were reading together both material related to the con, but also methodological stuff about ethnography, and sort of like developing a kind of cohesive set of relationships among us and developing a shared idea of what the hell we were doing with this project. Had we not had that, I think it would have ended up being very different. Like, I think our approach would have been a lot more kind of top down. Okay, here's what we're going to do. You go do this, you go do that. Whereas what ended up happening was a much more open-ended approach. Like, we really didn't want to overly prescribe what people would do because then that wouldn't really be authentic to the experience of the con, right? As the orange t-shirt example shows, like that really actually did help, right? The fact that the students didn't have like a hit list or like an assignment list that they had to get to. So in terms of the actual logistics on site, so we had this extended ramp up with the faculty team. We brought the students on about 6 months before the con and did training with them in the form of like a directed research course that they got credit for, and then like a lot of practice runs and things like that. We actually did a trial run at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival that year, which is sort of a good, modestly sized version where we could sort of both give the students some real world practice at a similar event, but also for our purposes, kind of just see if this even works. Like, like see if this is even going to work or if we've made a huge mistake and we need to like pivot to some other approach. I think in some ways the most interesting thing we did was we were trying to figure out, okay, like in traditional ethnography, right? You have a lone ethnographer, maybe one or two, small group of people. They go into the field for an extended period of time, which is not possible at a temporary event like Comic-Con, right? So already part of the idea of the swarm was like, it's a short-term event, but if we have more people, we can kind of like get more of it all at once. But in traditional ethnography, you go in and you take jottings, right? Which are your rough notes that you're taking while you're in the field. And those jottings form the basis for your more in-depth, fully written out field notes, which are like kind of more narrative, more detailed, but they're based on the jottings that you take. And jottings can include multimedia stuff too, like photos and videos and audio and whatever, sketches, maps. So normally it would just be like one person goes in, they produce a bunch of that material, and then they write their field note and they analyze it. In this case, we really wanted the collaborative nature of the project to be reflected in the way that we gathered the information, right? Like not just kind of setting everyone loose and then like getting together afterwards to talk about it. And so what we did was we actually used Discord of all things, the sort of, chat slash, social media platform, and created separate channels for everyone's jottings because at the con, it is not unusual to be on your phone, taking pictures of things, writing things down, right? Like everyone does that because that's just what it's like to be at the con. And so we figure that's actually the least obtrusive way to take field notes, like as opposed to like a clipboard with, your pencil or whatever. And so we took our field notes directly into Discord as comments. And what this meant was everyone could kind of half pay attention to what other people were doing at the same time. It was this sort of like real-time connectivity between members of the team. And of course, it was like a huge volume of information. So nobody was paying attention to everything, but you could interact a little bit, right? Like you could react to things. If I was in a panel and I said, oh, like someone else is actually also in this panel. That's interesting. Maybe we should like debrief afterwards. And it sort of allowed for the multi-perspectival nature of the project to be present during fieldwork itself. And so that really added a lot to the experience. It's something that I think, again, is like somewhat novel in terms of like we were very much inspired by other approaches to collaborative ethnography. We definitely didn't invent this concept, but I think that tweak on it was something somewhat unique. And then coming out of that, so we produced this huge volume of jottings. Everyone individually wrote up their field notes and put it all together into documents. And again, we wanted to make sure that it didn't just kind of revert back into like a lone ethnographer approach where everyone just ends up writing about their own experiences, right? Because then it's not really collaborative anymore, right? It's just sort of like parallel play. So what we did was we used data coding software. It's called Dovetail. It's actually like commercial software for market research, but it works for academic research as well. And basically we were able to upload all of the documents. And then we had some of the undergrad students hired again to basically create like an easily navigable finding system so that any given researcher could go in and be like, well, I'm writing about cosplay. So I want to see all this stuff about cosplay. And you can sort of, it's like a tagging system basically, right? So you can sort of click cosplay or like cross-reference it. Where it's like, well, I want to talk about cosplay and like, like gender representation. Sort of like use that keyword with this keyword and sort of like find the notes. And so the hope here, and we are still in the process of analysis and writing up all of this stuff, but the hope is that that again allows us to extend the kind of collaborative kind of spirit of the project, even as some of us are off writing on our own, not necessarily collaboratively. We're still reading in one another's work. We're still drawing on this like big collective pool of notes and information. And so the hope is that, again, that this produces arguments that are kind of like have a solid foundation in this broader assessment or observation of the con.
That's really cool. Yeah, and I'm sure it must be like kind of like daunting as well, like to get all of this like information and like put it together.
For sure, yeah. My own field notes were over 100 pages. A couple of other people hit that marker as well. And so, yeah, it was very necessary to have some of the finding aids and things like that. And I think what's useful about having a huge volume of data like that is that it is very easy to jump to a conclusion based on your own experience and then look at as like, oh, like someone else interpreted this totally differently than I did, right? Or someone else saw this from, a literal or figural different angle and came to a totally different experience. And so that aspect of it has been really valuable, I think. And so like I would say it's worth it. It's worth the kind of like challenge of working with such a big, unwieldy, large volume of qualitative data.
That's really cool. And another observation that stood out to me about what you wrote about this was how one of your students, sure you mentioned like their understanding, attending the Comic-Con increased their like understanding of how influential the Japanese media industry is. And I was wondering whether like you and your team were able to like find anything about like how kind of like these big like cultures, not like a specific, like even like a specific media company, either big or small or anything, but like actually all these people like come in support of a culture and like build on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Shout out to Shiroi Wu, who is one of the undergrad students on the project from Book of Media Studies. And I think that was a keen observation on her part. And I think it reflects on the one hand, it reflects the fact that, like, for the students on the project, particularly the undergrads, like Japanese media cultures, right? Japanese media franchises, the primary thing that they are interested in a lot of cases, I think, right? Or one of the primary things they're interested in. And so they were just noticing that stuff way more than, I'm a big reader of manga, but beyond that, not necessarily super familiar. And so there's lots of things that would just, yeah, I'd be like, that appears to be a Japanese franchise, but beyond that, I know nothing about it. Although the writer and artist of Vinland Saga was there. I didn't get to see him, but I did get to see some of his original art, which was very cool. However, I think what Shiroi's comment really captures is the fact that there has been a huge rise in interest in North America and fandom in North America. Like what was once maybe a more kind of niche like fan culture within the North American context for the last few decades has become part of the mainstream, I think, in a real way. The way that when you go to a big major bookstore chain and there's like shelf after shelf of manga, when Studio Ghibli is a household name, like I think that we are seeing a real kind of peak in, maybe not a peak in that it's going to go down, but like a high watermark of North American interest and awareness of Japanese pop culture. And so the con reflects that, I think. Again, I haven't been going for a long time. I've only been for this research project, but like based on what I've seen at other similar events over the years, including Toronto Comic Arts Festival and some of the gaming stuff that I've seen, it has become more and more visible. It wasn't always as visible as it is, but we're at the point now that, guests like the creator of Vinland Saga, Junji Ito, the Japanese horror manga artist, was like one of the guests of honor at this thing and one of the hottest tickets in town to get it. Like that was one of the things that people lined up for, like desperate, super early, desperate to get in, including members of our team. And so it's a very visible part of what the thing is now. Whether that translates into a meaningful cultural engagement beyond the fandom of the thing itself. I think I would defer to others to sort of make arguments about that. It's certainly, I'm going off the top of my head right now, but it's probably the second most prominent national media industry represented at something like Comic-Con now. There were others. Project K, which is an Indian action epic that had a Hall H panel this year, and it was like really presented as like this is a historic first. Like this is like obviously Indian film industries, of which there are multiple, are huge, right? But that's not something that you would necessarily usually associate with something like Comic-Con. And so that was really interesting to see. It was like this is obviously like an intentional thing to try and put this film and by extension Indian film and media industries on a global stage in a new way. Again, taking advantage of this reputation that Comic-Con has for being like the place to reach a sort of core audience of fans who are somehow going to anticipate the wider fandom, the wider mainstream audience. So while it is pretty predominantly like American in its focus, it's certainly not exclusively. And in terms of like the independent creators and like the fan artists and stuff who are there, a lot of the stuff they're creating is based on their favorite anime, like tons of Ghibli art and things like that. Tons of, again, like I'll be like, I don't know what manga this is based on, but I like this fan art of it, like it was very, very visible. And so I think maybe the way of looking at it is we sort of, if you have the sort of classic geek culture trinity of like comics, science fiction, and like horror, maybe we could definitely add like manga and anime to that as like a highly visible thing that people move pretty freely between as well. Like I think for some of our students that was like the only thing they were interested in or the primary thing, but I think for others on the team it was just one of many cultural industries that they were super super interested in.
That's really cool. And it's really great that these cons are now being more, I guess, like accessible to all of these like other markets and industries to get like a wider audience and also like reach like their fan base.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because I would say that there isn't necessarily a ton of visibility of people from those industries, right? Like you have like these star creators who show up, but like they're there typically hosted by their American publisher, for example. Like the Project K big Hall H panel for the Indian film was sort of the exception to that, where there was like a lot of people related to that project were present. But it's sort of interesting because it is so much about, as you say, like broadening that audience. People do, I think, come from all over the world to go to Comic-Con, but I think it is absolutely majority North American. So yeah, and it's an interesting, again, like once again, we sort of come back to this theme of like Comic-Con is a place where like lots of different things intersect and produce interesting encounters, interesting sort of cultural ripples.
That's really cool. And it was really great to hear all of that. And it's really great to like hear about yours and your team's experience at San Diego Comic Con.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great.
So as we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to add to this discussion?
So the one thing I'll add is that we also made a comic book, I'm showing it to you here, called Comic Book Comics #1. And it is what we hope to be the first of a number of different issues that are basically like a comic version of the research that we've done. We thought, making comics based on academic research and particularly ethnographic research has become somewhat common. U of T Press actually has like a whole imprint dedicated to ethnographic graphic novels. But we thought, like, well, we're doing research that is actually, in some sense, about comics and comics culture. So it's like particularly interesting to do. And so we worked with a little company called Petroglyph in Ottawa and an artist that they connected us with in Europe to produce this comic. And it's sort of just like a more accessible way to learn about like what we've done with the project. The long-term hope would be to publish a few issues and then put it together as like a book, but taking it one step at a time. But I'm very excited that in a couple weeks at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, we're doing a panel as part of their Library and Education Day to talk about the research project in general and to sort of do a bit of a, it's not exactly a launch for the comic, but to promote the comic as well. So we'll be doing our own Comic-Con promotional labor around our own work coming up. So I'm excited about that. And you can actually read that comic for free online as well. And I'll share the link so you can put it in the description.
That's really great. This was so exciting, Phelan. It was really cool again to hear about all those experiences. Someone who hasn't had such an experience before. So kind of like experiencing it through what you and your team experienced was definitely Really cool and really appreciative. That concludes our episode of Curious Campus with Professor Phelan. If anything you heard today interests you, definitely look into his Comic-Con comics and keep up with the research that they'll be sharing about their experience at the San Diego Comic-Con. Stay tuned to Curious Campus.